Central to Oswald Spengler's philosophy of history is the idea of the prime symbol, a simple geometric or spatial shape that represents a culture's conception of ultimate reality. Each culture has its own prime symbol, which structures how it perceives the cosmos and reveals its unique soul. Before we can understand prime symbols, though, we first need to understand Spengler's method of comparative morphology. Spengler's view of history was far removed from the common linear, ancient, medieval, modern model, and he criticized it as being too Eurocentric. He claims it treats all of past history as merely a backdrop for current life in the West, and thus he labeled it Ptolemaic, akin to the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy's model of the solar system, where the Earth was at the center and the planets revolved around it. Spengler's model of history, in contrast, does not privilege any particular culture with having ultimate truth or as inherently better than any others. Each culture is its own organism, with its own ideas, passions, life, will, feeling, and its own death. He writes in Decline of the West, "Each culture has its own new possibilities of self-expression which arise, ripen, decay, and never return. There is not one sculpture, one painting, one mathematics, one physics, but many, each in its deepest essence different from the other, each limited in duration and self-contained." Spengler's model is therefore Copernican. No culture holds special priority, just as no planet is central in Copernicus's model of the solar system. Spengler presents world history, then, not as a series of linear events leading up to and culminating in our own time, but as a collection of high cultures similar to organisms, where none are more important than the others. He estimates a number of high cultures have emerged throughout the course of history. Some examples are the Egyptian, Indic, Chinese, Arabian, Classical, and Western. Spengler spends the majority of the focus on these last two, the Classical, which he calls the Apollonian, and the Western, or Faustian. Each of these cultures is a separate living entity with its own unique soul. Spengler describes the birth of a culture metaphysically. A culture is born in the moment when a great soul awakens out of the proto-spirituality of ever-childish humanity, and detaches itself, a form from the formless, a bounded and mortal thing, from the boundless and enduring. It is this great soul of a culture that gives it its individuality, and impresses upon its people a specific world outlook on religion, philosophy, the sciences, history, art, and architecture. A culture's soul and world outlook can be distilled into a simple geometric or spatial shape, the prime symbol. Prime symbols embody the fundamental worldview of a people. By understanding a culture's prime symbol, one can intuit certain characteristics of the culture itself. Let's explore the classical and Western prime symbols and how they express the world outlook of their respective cultures. The prime symbol of classical or Greco-Roman culture is the concrete body, revealing a concern with the tangible, bounded, external, and immediately present. The primary art form, therefore, was the freestanding statue of the human body. Sculpture defined classical culture more than any other art form. But in the Greek vase paintings that prevailed from the Archaic to the Hellenistic periods, one still finds evidence of the classical prime symbol. For example, no horizon or background is typically found in vase paintings. The artists were only concerned with the characters in the immediate setting. There is no depth at all to the works. Even the color choices reveal a concern for the sensuous experience. Reds and yellow-oranges are the dominant colors used. These are the colors of the earth and of flesh. Green, and especially blue, colors of distance, of fields, oceans, and sky, are rarely used. It's notable that the ancient Greeks did not even possess a word for the color blue. In the religious realm, the classical conception of divinity conformed to this obsession with the tangible. The gods of Greece and Rome were essentially ultra-powerful humans who were still subject to greater forces. Classical gods had limits. The classical world's Doric temples embody the Apollonian prime symbol architecturally. Spengler notes how Doric temples are almost wholly external, composed of rows and columns with only a simple inner chamber to house a statue of a god or goddess. Mathematics, too, were influenced by the classical yearning for finitude. Classical mathematics reached a high point with the spatial geometry of Euclid, which was concerned with the defined, measurable shapes, lines, planes, and solids that modeled static figures. Central to a culture's world outlook is its relationship to time and history. The classical culture, again obsessed with the immediate and present, was what Spengler called ahistorical, having almost no notion of history. Though they could write great accounts of contemporary events like the works of Thucydides and Herodotus, anything further back in history faded into myth. This ahistorical attitude influenced their relationship with death, played out in their death cult. Spengler said all great cultures have their own death cult, and for the classical man, it often involved burning the dead, again a rejection of history because it left no trace of the past. And finally, in the political realm, the point-like polis was the main political unit. The boundedness of a city with its defined borders was a body politic in an almost literal sense. Aristotle, when discussing the ideal population size of a polis in Nicomachean Ethics, confirmed the classical desire for limitation and boundaries. The right number is perhaps not some specific number, but anything that lies between certain fixed limits. The Western or Faustian culture stands directly opposite the classical culture in terms of world outlook. While classical man was concerned with the near and the present, Faustian is concerned with reaching into the distance, a limitless will to power. The prime symbol of Western culture is therefore infinite space. Spengler believed this reach for the infinite manifested best in Western art as classical music. The 18th century masterpieces of Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach filled the atmospheres of theaters and halls with pure, uncontained, ethereal sound. These masterpieces lacked tangibility. In painting, horizons and landscapes became dominant, an emphasis on distance. Blues and greens, again colors of depth, drew to mind the ocean, the fields, the expanse. But Western oil painting culminated in the proliferation of brown, which Spengler said carries the battle of space against matter to a decisive close. He writes that the browns of Rembrandt, for example, dissolved the tangible presences of the sense world into ethereal semblances. Its discovery marks the zenith of the Western style. Brown is a milieu, an undistinction, the ultimate color for a culture obsessed with infinite depth. Architecturally, the grand symbol of Faustian world feeling is the Gothic cathedral with its cavernous interiors, spires toward heaven, and stained glass windows that attempt to capture light itself. When inside, it gives the feeling that one is reaching out into infinite space. The supreme mathematics of the West is calculus, mathematics of dynamism. Western mathematics deals with functions rather than concrete numbers. The creation of multi-dimensional space culminating in the theory of relativity would have been incomprehensible to the classical man. The Western soul, again in direct opposition to the classical, is deeply historical. According to Spengler, no other culture has been as concerned with history as the Faustian. This presents itself in that the typical literary form of Western culture is the biography, the history of an individual or people who contend with forces both outside of themselves and within. The religion of Faustian man has been molded by this deeply historical instinct too. Out of all the symbols of Western Christianity, none manifests the Faustian feeling for time and history quite like that of the Virgin Mother and Child, with the mother being a figure of time itself. Politically, Western culture opposes the point-like cities of classical in favor of the nation-state, which spans a wide geographical area. Now we have a basic idea of prime symbols and how they manifest in the form languages of each culture. We've contrasted the classical and Western cultures, who have opposing world outlooks. But what about the other cultures Spengler identified? What were their prime symbols? The Arabian or Magian culture, which we will discuss in detail in a later video, had the enclosed dome as its prime symbol, most likely born from the desert caves of the Middle Eastern and Arabian regions. Mosques are the great architectural instantiation of this symbol. The Egyptian culture had the narrow path, born from the Nile River. One can see this symbol embodied in the temple column arrangement at Thebes, or the enclosed paths of the great pyramid halls. And the Cynic or Chinese had the wandering path, best embodied in the lush landscape gardens traditional to Chinese culture. Spengler's conception of prime symbols is unique among philosophers of history, and offers a deep insight into the differing world outlooks of each culture. Spengler believed the next great culture would be in the East, possibly Russia, and its prime symbol, still not yet fully manifested in its cultural forms, was the infinite plane. But if not Russia, one wonders where the next great culture might arise, and what its prime symbol could be.